Okay, so as I say, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this talk. We've got Caroline Tait joining us today to talk us through her work. Caroline is a former GP and national clinical lead for NHS Digital and is trained to be a consultant in public health, and her PhD forms part of that training. And she's just about to submit her thesis from a 4-year integrated master's and PhD in data analytics and society. So over to you when you're ready, Caroline.
That's great, thank you. Just at this point in time, the window cleaner has decided to clean this window. So if there's some unusual noises, it's the window cleaner. Now just bear with me while I bring up my slides. Thanks for that, Hannah. So my name's Caroline Tait. I'm a GP by background, but have recently qualified as a consultant in public health. And as Hannah said, I undertook one of the ESRC funded data analytics PhDs, well, integrated masters and PhD. My PhD was focusing on evaluating cycling infrastructure using large-scale observational data. My supervisors were Roger Beecham in geography, Robin Lovelace in the Institute of Transport Studies, and Stuart Barber in maths. And what I'm going to talk to you today is the main bit of research I did, which has been looking at contraflow cycling, its safety and participation. So first of all, I'm going to talk to you about a paper that was published earlier in the year, which was where I looked at contraflows and cycling safety. And so just to give you a bit of background, so contraflow cycling is where a cyclist can travel both directions along a one-way street. That is, it's one way for motor vehicles. And here on the top right, we have an example of a contraflow bus and cycle lane. And we can see that this is one way for motor vehicles. And down here is a more common one-way street in places like the City of London, which is sort of a narrow one-way street, but you can see contraflow cycling is allowed along there. Now, contraflow cycling is a good thing in general. It can mean that cyclists can use quieter streets. By allowing cyclists to move in both directions, it reduces physical and mental energy in terms of route planning and also navigating a one-way street. And it makes the cycle route more direct and faster. One-way streets tend to be concentrated in urban centres, but when you've got lots of them, they violate core design principles for cycling infrastructure, in that cycle networks and routes need to be coherent, direct, safe, comfortable and attractive. So if you've got lots of one-way streets that cyclists can't use, it really interferes with the ability of cyclists to get around the city. It is a low-cost intervention compared to many other types of cycling infrastructure. So, for example, a kilometre of segregated cycle lane costs about £1 million. In 10-year-old value is about £1 million. Clearly, when you've got to have some signs and some white paint to implement contraflow cycling, that is considerably cheaper than fully segregated cycle lanes. And there has been DFT guidance for decades, really, but saying that cycling should be allowed in both directions on one-way streets, unless there's really good reasons why that isn't the case. So you might start thinking, well, why am I even talking about this? The issue is that there has been this perception that contraflow cycling is unsafe, and this is illustrated here by some quotes from Police Scotland, which was in response to some low traffic neighbourhoods, and also with contraflows included, I think in Glasgow. And really the motivation for actually looking at this came from my PhD partner, who is Cycle Streets. They do sort of journey planning and data analytics around cycling. And one of the founders of that organisation is a cycle campaigner in Cambridge, and he was telling me about how they had tried to get many one-way streets converted to allow contraflow cycling in Cambridge, which, as you probably know, has a high density of cycling. Lots of people do it, and one of the challenges they came back or kept coming up against was this perception that cycling contraflows was unsafe. And he said that, it'd be really helpful if there was some data that suggested or that examine this to really sort of try and say whether this perception is in fact based on reality. So that was really the source of the idea for this body of work. But these concerns around safety were not really in the evidence base. So it doesn't allowing cyclists to travel contraflow doesn't increase road traffic crashes. It in fact reduces road traffic crash risk. The likelihood of a cyclist being involved in a crash or a conflict was actually greater when they were travelling with motor vehicle flow. And actually the idea that because it might be a narrow street and you've got a cyclist coming up towards you, but that might be unsafe for motorists, it appears that motorists adjust their behaviour when encountering contraflow cyclists. But the current evidence base was mainly European. It was very short timescales, maybe a couple of months, maybe a couple of years, and tended to involve just a few hundred crashes. So it really felt to me like there was the opportunity or there was a real need for some UK-based research on this area, as with many things, often people feel more confident with evidence when it's being generated locally as opposed to internationally. So really what I wanted to do was to try and examine whether introducing contraflow cycling on one-way streets actually changes crashes involving pedal cyclists. So in order to answer that question, and this was a big data PhD, so it had to be big data, I needed to find a location where there were lots of one-way streets that had contraflow cycling allowed. I needed to go somewhere where there was lots of cycling because actually I wanted lots of people exposed to this particular type of infrastructure. I also wanted a decent number of crashes as well in order to detect whether there was a change before and after the contraflow cycling was allowed. There were some key bits of data I also needed to know. I needed to know where the infrastructure was implemented, and that is actually a lot harder than you may think. I also needed to know when contraflow cycling was allowed to allow this before and after analysis. And I really wanted to use many years worth of data as cycling and crashes are highly dependent on time of year, and they're frequently in small numbers. So you need many years worth of data to really start being able to draw some conclusions. So really the only place that I could do this type of research was London. And there's good reasons for that. There's lots of road traffic crashes. We have reasonable data on cycling volume from Transport for London, and all London boroughs have to publish something called a traffic regulation order when they introduce contraflow cycling. A traffic regulation order is allows the legal exemption of cyclists to travel contraflow on a one-way street. And London boroughs have to publish these in the National Public Record, the Gazette, and these are then available online. So that was the only way I could actually get data on where contraflow cycling was allowed and also a date of implementation. So I couldn't really do it anywhere else in the country. So what we have here is an example of a TRO. And I think this is for Camden, and this is then, you can sort of see the data it has, the sort of date, the borough, it then tells you the road and the direction and that sort of thing, although not all TROs are completely complete on some of that data. So what did I actually start doing? So the first TRO I could find online in the Gazette was from 1998. And obviously the COVID pandemic hit in 2020. So I didn't want to have COVID influencing the results. So I limited the timescale from between 1998 and 2019, which is 22 years. And I found in the 14 inner London boroughs that there were 508 one-way streets that had contraflow cycling introduced during those 22 years. So on the left here, we've got a map of the boroughs, and all the black lines are roads that allow contraflow cycling. You can see a high sort of density here in the city and Westminster, and either side of the River Thames, but there are some elsewhere as well. On the right here, we have 1998 through to 2019, and what this shows is when the contraflows were introduced, this being a cumulative number, so you can see a real sort of steep increase there and there, and this is the actual number of contraflows introduced on that for those years. Here we've got a few contraflows that were removed. I think it was 7 in total. So that was the data I had on the one-way streets with contraflow cycling. So then what I needed to do is to look at the crashes that were related to these roads. So we have a very good road traffic crash data set in the UK, colloquially known as Stats 19. And what I did was apply a buffer around all the roads. So the black lines here are the roads, the pink buffer around it is 10 meters, and the idea behind that is that there's some spatial inaccuracy on how road crashes are recorded, and we wanted to capture all the crashes within 10 meters of the roads. And the turquoise dots are crashes, and you can see that there's quite a lot of dots at what appear to be junctions, and we'll come on to that in a minute. So on these 508 roads, what did I find? Well, during the 22-year period, there was nearly 1,500 crashes within 10 meters of one of these roads. 788 occurred before contraflow cycling was allowed. A further 703 occurred when contraflow cycling was allowed, and 7 occurred after contraflow cycling was removed. So then I wanted to measure, well, what is the crash rate for involving pedal cyclists? And clearly, some roads would have had a very long pre-contraflow period, whereas others would have had a very long contraflow period. So I needed to adjust the number of crashes based on the amount of time exposed to the type of infrastructure. And the other thing I wanted to take into account was that there had been a significant change in the amount of cycling in London during the 22-year period. So it wasn't possible to compare a crash that occurred in 1998 with 2019. And to show you, to illustrate this, the bottom here is Transport for London data. So they do an annual cordon count. So they have strategic cyclist cordon counts. So they have basically concentric circles, roughly concentric circles, around the centre of London, and they count whenever a cyclist goes across that cordon. So the one at the bottom here, this is when they cross from into outer London from the shires. This is when they cross into inner London, and this really high one you can see is when people cross into central London. The vertical lines here, this is when the congestion charge was introduced, and this was when the London bombings happened. And they were both those activities were felt to have quite a big impact on cycling in London. So then I wanted to adjust this crash rate to take into account this significant change in volume of cycling, and also to then estimate the uncertainty around the crash rates. And to do that, I used bootstrapping to generate 1,000 crash data sets, calculated the crash rates for each data set, and then generated confidence intervals around that. So what did I actually find? So looking at the overall crash rates involving pedal cyclists. So what we've got here is we've got raw rates, and then we've got adjusted rates when I've taken into account the change in cycling volume. So once we've taken into account cycling volume, you can see that there is no difference in the crash rate when contraflows are implemented. The top one is the pre-contraflow crash rate, the middle one, the contraflow one. And yeah, that's the main thing there. The next thing I looked at was junctions. So if you remember back to the map showing the roads, I sort of said there's a lot of crashes that occur at junctions. And so what this is demonstrating is that the crash rates are higher when a junction is within 10 meters. And you can see that holds true whether there's a contraflow or not. So junctions are not good news for cyclists in general. That is not a new finding, that is well known. Now, some of the roads that introduced contraflow cycling had different states beforehand. So some of them were two-way roads, which then were converted to one-way and allowed contraflow cycling at the same time. And others were existing one-way streets that allowed contraflow cycling. So I wanted to look and see whether these existing one-way streets, the crash rates on these, differed from when they were two-way streets and they introduced a one-way street and contraflow cycling. And what you can see here is that when it goes from two-way to one-way, that the crash rate actually reduces. The Stats 19 dataset also has information about the direction the vehicle was travelling in, including the bicycle. So this then allowed me to look at whether there was a difference in the crash rates between the cyclists when they're travelling with the motor vehicle traffic or against it. So firstly, looking before contraflows were introduced, we can see that there was no difference between the with flow and the contraflow, and that the same is true when contraflows were introduced. So there is no higher crash rate if a cyclist is travelling against the flow of traffic. What it did see was that the crash rate was much higher when the cyclist was not travelling along the direction of the road, i.e. they were turning, which is again consistent with what we found earlier around the junctions being the most dangerous location. Now, crash rates are one thing, but also, could there be a chance that introducing contraflow cycling actually makes more or alters the severity of cyclist injuries? So I also wanted to have a look at that. So you might be wondering why Ed Sheeran's there. So casualties are described in three categories, either as fatal, seriously injured, or slightly injured. And basically anything above an Ed Sheeran, so anything like Ed Sheeran, like a broken bone, head injury, that sort of thing is considered a serious injury. So slight things are scrapes, bruises, that sort of thing. And again, what we saw was once we adjusted for changing cycling volume, there was no change in pedal cyclist severity classification at all. So not only is there no higher rate of crashes, there's no change in the severity. Obviously, this is a bit of research, so we always like to talk about the limitations of the research. So the big one was the traffic regulation orders. So they didn't necessarily have the correct information on there. There was missing information, and so the quality of the input data was limited, but this is the only data source we have at the moment for this type of infrastructure. The crash data, we know that crashes involving pedal cyclists are underreported, and that there are issues with, in particular, with the spatial location of crashes. But again, this is the best data that is available, and it is nationally recognised as such. The cycling volume data, again, it was the best data we had available, but clearly it lacked the spatiotemporal granularity that we really want in understanding crash risk. And one of the things I assumed was that as cycling volume increased, that the number of crashes would go up, i.e. that it was a linear risk. But we know that's possibly untrue, because there's this concept of safety in them, or there's this fact of safety in numbers, whereas the volume of cycling goes up, the safety actually improves. But there is no data, again, at a granular level that would really allow me to improve that assumption. And finally, I didn't take into account other factors such as weather, time of the day, road state. So why are these findings important? So as I mentioned at the start, there's been lots of challenges around introducing contraflow cycling on one-way streets, but now we have the first UK-based data, 22 years, over 500 streets, that really looks at this, and we feel it, provides reasonably good evidence that it is safe, and that I mentioned it's a low-cost intervention. It can really improve the cycling environment, and evidence from Europe suggests it attracts more cyclists, particularly including new cyclists, and reduces things like cycling on the pavements. So the key research recommendations coming out of this was really that UK highway authorities should be looking at their one-way streets with a view to converting them to allow contraflow cycling unless there are strong reasons against it. And that maybe they should start looking at some of their two-way streets too if they want to improve road safety. In Belgium and France, there is legislation that means that all one-way streets by default allow contraflow cycling unless there's significant reasons. And one of the recommendations was that that sort of legislation is considered here. And I suppose one of the key bits of thinking for me was up until this point, there was this default assumption. This was like that contraflow cycling is unsafe, but how many other bits of infrastructure are not implemented, or other cycling related issues are not addressed, because there is this assumption that's been long held that actually could be explored further. To really improve this and to improve evaluation of cycling infrastructure, I think we need better access to things like the traffic regulation orders, and that should be coming because electronic traffic regulation orders is on its way. We also need much better data sets around cycling infrastructure, particularly around data implementation and the spatial data of it, including things like width of lanes and that sort of thing, because that is not something that's captured or made available easily. We need much better data on cycling volumes. We also need open data on speed limits of roads, although that is now available, but also open data on average road speeds, because that is particularly important for cycling infrastructure evaluation. So the second part of that, so having looked at the safety, I wanted to then look at, well, actually, on these roads that I've identified, is there any evidence that when they're introduced that people will actually start using them, because that's a key driver for most forms of cycling infrastructure. And again, this was a really under-researched area. The studies conducted so far have been generally of poor quality, involving very few streets, short duration. They don't take into account factors that might influence cycling. So these are sort of the four studies that look at cycling volume after contraflow introduction, and you can see they're really just doing hours of study after it's introduced. So really quite, there's not a lot there. So what I then wanted to do was to examine whether on the roads that I'd identified, was there any change in cycling volume. I also wanted to look at, again, this existing one-way streets versus two-way streets that were converted to one-way with contraflow. And I wanted to try and see if I could address some of the issues around improving cycling volume estimation, to allow to sort of take into account things like time trends and seasonality. And then I wanted to do a little bit of a qualitative type work to look at the streets to identify factors and as to why changes may or may not exist. So to do this bit of research, I actually went to Strava Metro. So Strava Metro is Strava Metro is the sort of database of Strava. So users of Strava record their activities, and if they're given their consent, it can be made available to researchers or local authorities via Strava Metro. And that's available via an online dashboard. And what that really does is it gives you the spatial temporal granularity you need on cycling volume data. because it breaks roads down into edges and then gives you a count of cyclists along that edge and in which direction they're going on. It gives it at various different time levels, so hour, day, month, year, and it breaks it down by number of trips, number of unique individuals. It gives you some data on age and gender, and it also tells you the direction. Unfortunately, the only data available is the previous 5 years. So because I started doing this work last year, the earliest data I could get was 2018. And they then remove it. So now you can't get the 2018 data. So quite frustrating that I couldn't get a nice long period of data. There are issues with Strava data. So they have a privacy sort of anonymization type process. So you will only get a count on an edge if 3 or more people have used it, or 3 or more trips have occurred on that edge, and if and then they round it up to the nearest 5. So you end up with a lot of edges with 5, 10, 15, maybe 100,000, but you just don't have that real granularity around it. There's also multiple issues with Strava's representativeness. It is predominantly used by younger males for leisure cycling. So a lot of groups are underrepresented in Strava datasets. It is a sampled data set. Users have to opt in for data sharing, and they also have to opt in to share that particular journey. And a lot of the processes are very opaque, so they apply algorithms to determine journey purpose and that sort of thing, but you don't know how they've done it. So it is an imperfect data set. So looking at the 508 roads I started with, I ended up with 28 existing one-way streets that introduced contraflow cycling and 14 two-way streets. It was the main reason for that was because I only had these 2018-2019 data, and then I needed to have a number of months included, and then also a number of months before and after the contraflow was introduced. So yeah, 28 and 14 streets. So in order to get the Strava counts, I then had to identify the Strava edges that matched my contraflow streets. I then had to calculate monthly counts and identify the direction the cyclist was travelling along on that edge. Because I wanted to try and adjust for this seasonality and also things like changing Strava users, I wanted to generate expected counts for each of those edges. So to do that, I created a data set for London, or for inner London, should I say, of comparable roads. So I got rid of things that were footpaths, went through parks, that sort of thing, because they weren't contraflow roads. They couldn't be contraflow roads in the way I'd previously used them. And then using January 2018 as a baseline, I obtained the percentage change in each month, and then calculated an expected monthly count for each road segment. So what did I find for that? So these are the percentage change in monthly Strava counts across inner London for this data set I created. So top left here, so all the y-axes are percentage change. The x-axes are the 24 months of 2018 and 2019. So top left here, we've got trips as the triangles and people as the circles. And you can see there's a clear seasonal variation in the number of trips and people. There's more trips and people in the summer, there's less in winter. In the summer, you can see that the actual number of people goes up. So that's clearly, well, showing that the number of people is affected more by the time of year than the number of trips. On the right here, we've got a gender split. So the circles are females, the males are triangles. So again, we can see larger change in females than males. And on the bottom left here, we've got leisure versus commutes. So leisure is the circles. So again, we can see that leisure cycling is influenced more by time of year in Strava users. Just for information on the right here, this line is the mean temperature, and these are the percentage of wet days. So again, we can see the temperature increases, more people cycle. So what I've got here is really quite a complex slide, so I'm going to try and take you through it. So these are the 28 one-way streets that introduced contraflow cycling in the 2 years of this particular study. So starting top left and going across, across. These are ordered in time sequence. So this is and this is here. The grey line is the date of contraflow implementation. So these are the top row are the ones that had the contraflows introduced the earliest, and these bottom ones are contraflows were introduced much later in the study period. Now, many roads we had small numbers of Strava users on for that month, so maybe 20, maybe 50. So those are the ones that are white. And what you can see is these white ones tend to be quite angular, lots of jerking in terms of the counts, and compare those to the coloured ones, you can see the curves are much more smoother, which is what we'd expect due to the volume of data. So the ones I particularly wanted to draw your attention to, so the blue ones. So these blue ones all have low, sorry, I should clarify the things. So red is observed and blue is the expected count. So here we can see on this road, we had low levels of illegal contraflow cycling before contraflow implementation. And once contraflow cycling was allowed, we saw this big increase in the number of Strava users using this road. And again, down here, really low levels of contraflow cycling before implementation, then this massive increase. If I remember rightly, this is like up to 3,000 here. And similarly, on this other road, we've got a very similar pattern. But then on some other one-way streets, we can see that there's actually higher levels of illegal contraflow cycling before contraflow is allowed. So here, here, and down here. But then we still get increases in the volume of contraflow cycling once it is allowed. And then we've got some where there's either these red ones where the volume of contraflow cycling either tends to drop or doesn't really have any impact when contraflow cycling is allowed. So what I wanted to then do, so we've got quite a mixed bag. We've got some that seem to be super successful, these blue ones, the green ones where we seem to see reasonable levels of success, and then these other ones where it doesn't seem to have had any impact. And these coloured ones are all the ones that have got higher volumes, so over maybe 150 Strava counts per month. So then I wanted to try and understand perhaps what might be going on. So this is one of the successful ones. So this is Clarence Terrace. It's near Regent's Park. And what you can see here is before and after photos of contraflow entrance and exits. So this is the entrance here. So before it was implemented, you can see there are 2 lanes of traffic going along this road. And then after it was implemented, you can see that there's a contraflow cycle lane there. You've got a protective island there, and then you can see the lane going along there. What you probably can't see is there's quite wide hatching as a cyclist continues along the cycle lane here. So from a cycling infrastructure perspective, that is a reasonable standard of contraflow cycling implementation, good protection. This is actually quite wide. I know the photo doesn't suggest that, but it is quite a wide cycle lane. And then you've got this really quite significant width of hatching, painted hatching, that really demarcates the lane for motorists. So this is considered to be a reasonable implementation of contraflow cycling. The next one I wanted to show you was this street called Malcolm Street, and these again are before and after photos. So before, we can see is a two-lane road, sorry, one-way street, but with 2 lanes, should I say. And then what they've done is put in really quite a nice wide contraflow cycle lane. They've re-tarmacked the road, so it's nice smooth tarmac. They've put this island here, and what they have is different coloured tarmac that demarcates, and painted lines actually, but demarcate the cycle lane along there. So again, it's quite nice cycling infrastructure, and at a reasonable standard. So finally, I just wanted to show you this one, which was one of the ones where we actually saw a fall in the volume of cycling after it was introduced. So what we have here is, again, before, there's a question from Noel. Malcolm was a success. It was a blue one, I think. Oh, hang on. Yes, it was a blue one. So the final one I just wanted to show you was Hammersmith Grove. So this was one of the red ones. So here we have the pre-entry status. So you can see again, it was 2 lanes. They had an island here for pedestrians, and then they allowed contraflow cycling, and this is what it looks like now. And really what you can probably see is it doesn't even look like it allows you to cycle contraflow along there. It isn't until you get to about here that you can see a painted cycle on the road. There's no sign here saying no entry except cyclists, and you can see it's also really narrow, so it's really just not inviting anyone to use it. What you can also probably see is they've really altered the pavement and road layout. So they've created lots of space for pedestrians, and they've put outdoor seating here. So it's really very nice to sit outside. Well, if you want to sit next to a road, I suppose. And they've made it really green. But again, that makes it quite difficult for cyclists, because it's hard to see because there's lots of greenery. There's people there as well. And they've also continued to allow a lot of parking along the road, which you can see here. And what you tend to find is the motorists stick to the middle of the lane, which then doesn't allow much space for contraflow cyclists. So I think we'd all consider that to be a bad implementation. So this isn't published yet. I've got to do a little bit more work on this, and I've really just touched on some of that, some of the findings so far. But one of the things I'm going to do is validate the Strava counts against manual counts produced by Transport for London, to really understand, well, how representative Strava is on these roads for cyclists as a whole. What's the key findings so far is really about the local context being really important, and that things like connectivity is very important. So some of the other roads, it appeared that they had poor connectivity to existing cycle routes. So although physically the infrastructure appeared to be really good, they didn't connect to anything, and so people weren't using them. Interestingly, there were multiple streets where you could see that there wasn't much change, and so it would be really helpful to maybe go back now and have another couple of years worth of data and see how things look. The final thing I just wanted to mention is a little bit about my new role. So Hannah mentioned about me being a consultant in public health, and I'm moving now. I've submitted my PhD. I'm starting in June at Bradford Council. So Bradford has been awarded a new NIHR funding stream. This is for 5 years, 5 million over 5 years. And the idea behind it is to develop local centres of research excellence based in local government. to really increase research capacity and collaboration at a local level, to really try and embed evidence base, or the evidence base, in decision making by policymakers in local government. And it is particularly focused on the wider determinants of health and health inequalities. And it's all about getting that research culture, capacity, collaborations, and providing leadership within the organisation to achieve those aims. What do I mean about the wider determinants? Well, obviously, our genetics influence our health and things like whether we smoke and alcohol. But actually only 10% of our health is really determined by healthcare. And so the wider determinants, things like how we live, where we work, what we're exposed to, are really vital in determining our health outcomes. And that's what this NIHR Health Determinants Research Collaboration is going to be doing research on. Bradford and Doncaster were two of the successful local authorities in this region, and their future bids, I think, going in for Wakefield and Rotherham. In terms of what will this new structure look like within Bradford Council, so we sit in the Chief Executive's office. We've got a research director, Dr. Ellen Flint, who's worked extensively with people like Michael Marmot and the Department for Work and Pensions, and they've appointed two consultants in public health, one of which is myself. And I've been asked to focus on research and data. So I'm hoping to continue my collaboration and working with LEADER and colleagues within LEADER for you to master's dissertations, internships, and that sort of thing. So we're going to have a lot of data, and so the expertise within LEADER would be vital, and collaborations with people in LEADER would be of great interest. So at some point, Hannah will be able to send through my new email address, although you can contact me at the moment on my university one. So I think that was it, Hannah. I haven't left too much time for questions, unfortunately, but
no, that's great. Thank you, Caroline. It's great to hear about your new role. Congrats. So we'll open the floor now for any questions coming through. Feel free to, anyone online, to switch on your camera and microphone, and anyone in the room if you've got anything. Yes, Sheridan.
Hi, thanks, Caroline. Brilliant. That was really interesting talk. Really, yeah, some really good work there. Great to hear about the Bradford Council as well. There's lots of things I could ask, but I just had a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is, I saw you working with Robin Lovelace, who's got the kind of propensity to cycle tool. I just wondered if you got any evidence of kind of how significant a difference introducing contraflow lanes could be, like how much potential is there to kind of transform our cycle network through that? And it might be a different research project, but the other thought was my sort of impression of Bradford is that there's a real, it's much more car dependent maybe than London. I don't know for sure, but that there's maybe quite a lot less cycling. So I'm just wondering if you had a thought about how different the challenges might be in Bradford.
Thank you, Sheridan. So yes, in terms of the impact of the contraflow cycling, I think once I start validating against the TfL counts, that will be I'll be able to sort of generate some of those findings. So research from elsewhere, so say in Glasgow, they reckon about 10% of cyclists are Strava users. So we could be talking, the one that I said was in thousands, that's Roehampton High Street. We could be talking 10,000 cyclists a month using that type of infrastructure, if that 10% is true. So it'd be really interesting to sort of see that, and I think there will be sort of spatial temporal variation in the counts. So hopefully I'll be able to give a more nuanced view of it. But Robin's obviously been heavily involved in this, and they are working with Strava and have at least some of the data. So it'd be interesting to see what he does with some of that going forward, particularly because the last census will be so is so problematic because people weren't commuting in their usual ways.
Okay.
Yeah. And in terms,
sorry, I was just, I suppose the question was, I mean, in terms of the infrastructure, do you think, in terms of where there's space for contraflow lanes, do you think that kind of can transform the network, or?
I think it potentially can in urban areas. I think in rural areas, you're not going to get the concentration of one-way streets where it's going to have such a big impact on a network overall. Whereas when you've got cities with one-way streets, particularly cities that are all now implementing or looking to implement low emission zones and all that sort of thing, you can really change things.
Okay.
Yeah, and you asked about Bradford and London. So London really is a special case. It's so frustrating. I couldn't do this research elsewhere, but London is such a special case in terms of how it's been funded, the mayoral support, all that sort of thing. And unfortunately, I think a lot of other places haven't had that degree of impetus, and it's taken them a long time to get where they are. I think it's going to take a long time for other cities such as Bradford to get to that level, but there is a lot of ambition out there in the sort of city regions to really make these changes.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Great stuff.
Great, thank you. We've got a few more questions. We'll go to Noel next, and then we've got a question in the room afterwards.
Hi Caroline, thanks, that was brilliant. I was really looking forward to this seminar, and if you don't mind, I'll be summarising it and posting it on my Facebook afterwards, because I think it's really important finding for cyclists and cycle activists as well, people in local authority. Can I just get some clarification? I kind of wrote down a bit that I saw on the slide about crashes with and against the flow, and I wasn't sure that I really understood, but I saw illegal contraflow had a lower crash rate than cycling with the flow. So if you could kind of explain that, or try to explain that, and just to explain that slide again, because I don't think I really understood what was going on.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. It did have a lower crash rate. Let me see if I can get it back up again. I'm sorry, some of those slides are a little bit complex. It was that one, I think. Yeah, so this was the crashes occurring in the pre-contraflow period. When it was a one-way street, obviously in the pre-contraflow period, you couldn't cycle contraflow. So that's why they were labelled as illegal contraflows. And then here we have the with flow on a two-way street that was pre-contraflow. So we've got this mixture of one-way streets and two-way streets. So if they were travelling contraflow on an existing one-way street, it was illegal. But if they were travelling contraflow on a two-way street, it was legal. Does that make sense? So there was no difference basically in the direction they were for travelling pre-contraflow. So it was fine. Cyclists travelling legally contraflow weren't at higher risk, but there were probably far less of them when it was not legal, if you see what I mean. I'm not very, it gets a bit confusing. I'm sorry, I'm not being very clear. So yeah, on a one-way street, if they were cycling illegally, they weren't at lower risk, but there was probably a lot less of them than when it was then allowed. So you probably would expect the population would be smaller.
The cycling rate would affect the lower crash rate.
Yeah.
But if it was adjusted, then it would possibly be more dangerous, legal contraflow. Possibly. You don't know.
Don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi Caroline, it's Mark Sumner here from in the room. Really interesting what you've been doing there, and as a commuter, cyclist commuter, it's really interesting seeing all this sort of stuff. And as a commuter that uses some of the cycle lanes in Leeds and Bradford and other parts of West Yorkshire, it's really interesting seeing the quality of the cycle lane provision and how well they've implemented best practice. And I guess the question is about policy almost, in terms of the work that you're doing. Contraflow could be done really well, or it could be done really badly, and we see in some cities, well, Leeds, I would argue, is quite bad at implementing good cycle lanes in many cases. So is there anything that you think in terms of policy that can be done to ensure that the level of quality or best practice that could be applied to things like contraflow, but not just limited to contraflow?
So yes, so I mean, there's these key design principles of safety, comfortable attractiveness, directness, and connectivity that are international principles around cycling infrastructure design. And in 2020, the Department for Transport updated its cycle infrastructure design guidance. It's a little bit of a tone, but it's actually really good in terms of how those principles need to be embedded throughout all forms of cycling infrastructure. So there is really good guidance out there. What Active Travel England have done, so Active Travel England are now the new body for promoting active travel, is that, well, both Active Travel England and the DFT, is they've basically said you're not going to get funding for any infrastructure unless you meet our standards of cycling infrastructure design. And the way they are managing that is they have a team of inspectors, and that when local authorities or city regions put in their bids for cycling infrastructure funding, their designs are assessed against these design standards. And Robin Lovelace, I don't know if people know, is working part-time for Active Travel England on their data. And so he's actually bringing in some of the stuff that we recommended from this research about having spatial data on cycling infrastructure. And so local authorities are also having to submit data, GeoJSON even, files of data, which are then added to a database, so that we are starting to build a database of cycling infrastructure. So they're linking funding basically to quality infrastructure, which I think is a massive step forward. But I think one of the really important things is that there is something about something being safe, but it also needs to be perceived to be safe, and also accessible. So whilst I might have found that there was no evidence they're unsafe, that doesn't mean that people are going to use them if they perceive it, any type of infrastructure, to be unsafe. And we know that's a particular issue for women, for parents with children, for older people. And so having safe quality infrastructure is really vital to get more people cycling.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. We've maybe got time for one or two more. So we've got Poppy next, and then there's also a question in the chat afterwards.
Hi, Caroline. That's been really, really interesting. Two questions. Where can I find out more? And the second question, when you were showing the contraflows, and I think this follows from actually the previous question about the infrastructure and the policy around it. You showed it from the perspective of the cyclist entering it, but actually I'm really keen to know what the car drivers are being warned about when they're coming in, as to whether they know I'm coming towards them on a contraflow, because they're the one in a ton of metal that's going to hit me. And I'd be interested whether you looked at that at all, because I mean, certainly that last contraflow that you showed us, the signposting for cyclists was absolutely dismal. The design was dismal.
Yeah,
I thought there's no way I'd ever go down that. And I'm wondering whether at the other end for the cars, it was similarly designed to actually be really quite off-putting to bikes.
Yeah, so excellent questions. No, I haven't looked at it from a motor vehicle perspective. That's partly, I suppose, from, and I haven't looked at it from a pedestrian perspective either, which was something I really wanted to do, but the data is even harder for that. Google Street View is excellent for looking at current infrastructure, but also historical snapshots, which is how I was able to look at what was there before. But in terms of letting motorists know, it is usually a blue sign with cycles on, I think, and then there's the painted line, which might be nothing. You also get the painted cycle on the road, so it really isn't ideal. And interestingly, one of the things when I looked at the most recent cycle infrastructure guidance, the previous version said you had to protect both the entrance and the exit. And now you protect it only says to protect the entrance. So I don't know whether it accidentally got dropped. But things like that are super important, because if they protect the exit, then that's clearer to the motorist coming along the one-way street. So no, I haven't looked at it, but it's a big thing.
Okay, there is another question in the chat. Raoul, I don't know if you want to quickly ask that question before we close.
Is that me? I put a comment just kind of following up from my question about the illegal contraflow. Maybe it would be really good to work out that adjusted illegal crash rate, compare it to the legal contraflow crash rate, and that would actually just demonstrate that legality is safer.
I'll have a look at that if I can. Yeah. Was it Raoul's question? Do I think it's necessary to create a new spatial analysis tool for cycling, or just improve the information feedback of the current tools? So I think what Robin's doing is actually doing that already. But so Robin, with Active Travel England, they're getting all these local authorities to send in spatial data around what cycling infrastructure are going to put in. So that's starting to build it up. I think so. The Department for Transport is also in the process of developing electronic TROs. So that is where local authorities would make them available electronically, and there is a spatial data collection element as part of that, although I don't know how compulsory it would be for an organisation to fill that in. The other big data source we have for cycling infrastructure is OpenStreetMap, where users contribute information about cycling infrastructure, which is probably one of the most, it's got the greatest sort of spatial temporal granularity of any data set, but you do have those issues with its user generated. So really for infrastructure at the moment, or cycling infrastructure, it is difficult, and also some infrastructure requires things like this traffic regulation order. So to allow contraflow cycling, you need a traffic regulation order. To put in a segregated cycle lane, you need a traffic regulation order. But not all types of cycling infrastructure need a traffic regulation order. So it is a bit of a mixed bag at the moment. But I think with the movement towards these digital TROs and the work that Active Travel England are doing, and the role that Robin's doing is around getting data at the centre for their funding, in order for it to be evaluated. I think it's, that is a real step forward, and I'm quite excited to see what we're going to have over the next sort of five years in that field.
Perfect. Thanks, Caroline. Lots of great questions. Thank you, everyone. And thanks for your time, Caroline, and everyone for joining us. Apologies, we've overrun slightly, but enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me.